Hey guys, welcome to today's video. We are here to take a little walk down memory lane. The other day I was looking to find a photo on my Instagram that had a date showing when I purchased an old makeup item in my collection, and as I'm scrolling through the years through my Instagram page, I found several eyeshadow palettes that I had kind of forgotten about, or like eyeshadow palettes that I've decluttered over the years. Some of them I was like, yes, glad it's gone. Others I was like, oh, a little nostalgic. And I thought that's just what I would share with you today, is finding the palettes that I have since decluttered, and I thought I'd let you know my thoughts. Like, do I regret decluttering them? Am I glad that they're decluttered? How did we feel about them? And maybe you'll recognize some of these eyeshadow palettes too. If you're new here, hello and welcome. My name is Kelly and I love all things makeup and beauty. I love talking, I love makeup, I love talking about makeup. So if you like to chat about makeup too, I would love to have you subscribe and be part of the K Bella fam. But why don't we go ahead and jump into the video. Okay, I'm gonna scoot over and insert pictures here because these are all eyeshadow palettes that I have decluttered. The first one that I came across on my feed and I was like, oh my gosh, I remember that, was Violet Voss times Laura Lee. Do you remember way before Laura Lee had Laura Lee Los Angeles, she collaborated with Violet Voss, another brand that I have not even thought about in forever, and she came up with this eyeshadow palette. There were, it looks like 20 shades, mostly neutral. You had that cute green shade in Smashly, you had a light basic shade, you had a black shade. I loved this eyeshadow palette. I loved this palette. I used the heck out of it. I created so many good looks with it, and now I'm staring at it and I don't remember why I decluttered it. Like, this is one, a lot of them I honestly like remember my thinking. I know why I got rid of it. This one, I don't know why I chose to get rid of it. It was a color story that I loved. It was an eyeshadow palette that I enjoyed. I enjoyed the formula. And obviously it is very old now. It's to the point where I wouldn't use it if it was still in my collection. And I wouldn't say that I like regret getting rid of it, but I just don't remember why. Like, I don't remember why I got rid of it because it was an eyeshadow palette that I loved very, very much. This, I was gonna say this is perhaps the oldest palette that I'm gonna talk about, but I don't think it is. I think maybe the second oldest. But Anastasia Beverly Hills, back in their day, in the height when they were coming out with eyeshadow palettes all at the time, the very first ABH eyeshadow palette that I tried was the Shadow Couture World Traveler palette. I remember my friend Nelsie, It's Beauty Bliss on Instagram, she would post looks with this, and I thought that her looks were amazing, so I went out and purchased this palette. And let me tell you, looking at it now, this is a palette, if it were released now, I would not purchase it. There is a very like rich royal purple shade, there is like a royal blue shade, there is a peachy shade, a very bright gold. You had that pink champagne shade that everybody and their mom was raving about from ABH. I did enjoy like the neutrals where we had Morocco, Spoiled, Fudge, Soft Peach, Bellini. I did use pink champagne. There was a black shade. I definitely used this eyeshadow palette a lot in creating looks for Instagram and for YouTube, but I didn't really use this eyeshadow palette outside of that. Like, I didn't use it in my day-to-day life. I'm assuming that I decluttered it and gave it away just because it was an eyeshadow palette that I hadn't used. I don't remember it like going bad. There was another video of mine that I filmed like years ago that I'm going to revisit, and in that video I talked about having 11 eyeshadow palettes, and I talked about it like it was so much, and now I'm like, oh my god, if only I had 11 eyeshadow palettes. But this is a time when I think I only had like 5 or 6 eyeshadow palettes, and I probably thought, ooh, I'm getting too many eyeshadows, and that's why I got rid of it. I don't regret it. I think it's fine. It's not one that I would use. I don't think that I liked it as much as the Laura Lee Los Angeles, but I do think this was my introduction to ABH. This is the eyeshadow palette that I wish I had in my collection. I do regret getting rid of my original Naked palette. This was the first like high-end, YouTube made me buy it eyeshadow palette that I purchased. When I started watching YouTube, the Naked palettes were all the rage. I think Naked and Naked 2 were out already when I first got to beauty YouTube. And I remember talking to my friend Smags and kind of going back and forth on if I wanted Naked or Naked 2, and then Naked 3 came out, and then like the whole Naked brand took off, the Naked line took off. And I did end up going with the Naked Original. That half-baked shade I used so much. Like every time I dipped into the eyeshadow palette, I was using that half-baked shade. I would go in with like the browns and put that gold on the lid. Overall, I didn't use this palette a ton, which is why I ended up decluttering it. Other than the half-baked shade, like every time I went into it, I created the same look and I thought it was good quality. I enjoyed it, but I just wasn't reaching for it a ton, and ultimately that's why I decluttered it. When I did declutter it, I wasn't feeling sentimental about it or anything. I mean, I knew it was like my first high-end purchase. I knew it was like a Naked palette, but I mean, I guess I didn't foresee the impact that, sorry, I have a hair, that beauty YouTube would have on my life, or that I'd be on YouTube years later or whatnot. But I ended up decluttering this when you could still get it. It was not discontinued yet. I think I gave it away to one of my friends. I was like, I'm not using it. Half Baked is the only one I use. Let me get it out of my collection. And then when they announced that the Naked palette was going to be no more, that's kind of when I started regretting it. I don't think I would have continued to use the eyeshadow palette, but it would have been fun to keep in my drawer as a memento. Like, that's why I keep my ABH Modern Renaissance now at this point. I would have probably decluttered it in a declutter if it weren't for like sentimental purposes. OG YouTube, like the Naked palette, really, it takes me back to a place, the beginning of my love for makeup, beginning of my YouTube days, and I wish that I just still had it around for that reason. These next two palettes also take me back to the OG YouTube days, and it is the Lorac palettes. I had both the Lorac 1 and Lorac 2, the Pro palettes. You can see in this picture in the Lorac Pro 1, I did hit pan in the mauve shade. You cannot see it in the Lorac Pro 2, but I ended up using the 2 more than the 1, and I did hit pan on that buff shade. I think I hit pan on the white shade. I hit pan on Nectar. By the time I decluttered this palette, the Lorac Pro 2 had several pans because that was the palette I was reaching for most often. I would travel with it. I would wear it on a day-to-day for work. I would ultimately recreate the same looks over and over and over, but I did end up loving that palette. Looking at the 2, the Pro 1 I thought initially was more my vibe, but I didn't really dip into it too much after getting the second palette. I don't regret getting rid of these. These would have been fun to have in my collection just like for nostalgia reasons, but like with the Naked, I wish I had that. Like, I do regret getting rid of that one. These would be cool to have, to be like, oh, OG YouTube favorites, but at the same time, like, I'm not mad that I decluttered them because I think their time came and went. They had their time to shine. I used the crap out of them, and now they're living somewhere else. Back in the day, Carly Bible was talking about BH Cosmetics. She did a collaboration. She came out with, 10 eyeshadows and 4 highlighter shades. I don't remember the name of it. I'm trying to see. I don't know. Whatever. It was the Carly Bible BH Cosmetics collab palette with 4 highlighter shades and the eyeshadows. People were raving about this. Raving about this palette on YouTube. And I did follow Carly. I did enjoy her. I was watching her actively at the time. So I went and purchased this eyeshadow palette. I kid you not, it had like no pigment, okay? This is coming from someone, look at my eyes right now. Subtle, subtle, subtle pink. I did this Barbie inspired look. It's a short on my YouTube. You can check that out if you're interested. My makeup is basic, okay? My makeup is toned down. I like very like light makeup, okay? I don't go in with bold looks very often. This was like nothing on my eyes. I remember I created a look with it. I took a picture and I sent it to Smags and I was like, do you see anything on my eyes? And she was like, are you wearing eyeshadow? I did not like the quality of this palette at all, to the point where I decluttered it pretty quickly out of my collection. But then, this is where I'm like, Kelly, use your brain here. But then Carly and BH went on to collaborate a second time with the Deluxe palette and more eyeshadows and more highlighter shades. And I went and purchased that one again. And I thought, this is going to be the one that I'm gonna love. It's gonna be more pigmented. I'm gonna use it more. It's gonna be great. And again, I decluttered it very quickly. I used the highlighter shades. I thought those were great, but the actual quality of the eyeshadows I thought were very subpar, and both of those palettes exited my collection very, very quickly after getting them. This next one, I wanted to love this quad. I wanted to love the very first quad that Desi Perkins and Katie from Lustrelux came out with Dose of Colors. They collabed with Dose of Colors, and they came out with this little quad. I don't even know what the name of it was, but it was that quad. I think it was a couple highlighters, and that's when their lip products came out. They launched it. I don't think I picked up a highlighter, but I got the lippies, and I ended up with the quad. I did not like the eyeshadow quad. All 4 of the shades were shimmer shades. 2 of them were more of a sheen. 2 of them were chunkier. And I just was not a fan of the formula at all. At all. I don't remember if I sold this one on my Poshmark or just gave it away, but this was another one. It was not in my collection too long because I just did not think the quality was great. And I toyed back and forth about keeping it because I loved Desi and Katie. I loved that they were doing their collab with Dose of Colors. I was so excited for them, but I did not like this palette at all. Then they went on to come up with the Friendcation palette. And the Friendcation palette, I went back and forth. I was like, do I get it? Do I not get it? I heard so many people, again, raving about it, saying it was a favorite for them. So I ultimately did go on to purchase the Friendcation palette. I still have it in my collection. That one I keep like the Modern Renaissance for like the memories and like a keepsake. I don't use it anymore. But that one I also didn't love. However, I did enjoy the matte formula. I found that it was the shimmers I did not enjoy from the Dose of Colors collab, and that quad was all shimmers, which is why it exited my collection quickly. But with the Friendcation palette, I thought the mattes were great. I just wasn't a huge fan of their shimmer formula. When I think of Morphe, I think of Jaclyn Hill. When I think of Jaclyn Hill, I think of Morphe. They had such a strong relationship for many, many years. I remember when Jaclyn first came out with her favorites set of single eyeshadows that Morphe already had, and it was in like the black container. I did have that palette and Declutter it, but the palette that I took a picture of to talk about was when she actually came up with her own shades. So it was the Jaclyn Hill favorite palette, the original, before it was reformulated, the first one. I went and picked that one up, and I loved this palette. Absolutely loved it. It was such a neutral palette. I pretty much stuck to the top 3 rows. I didn't really go into the bottom 2 where you do have pops of color and some deeper shades, but I used it like every single day to the point where there were times when I had to tell myself, put that palette to the side and don't use it. But as the years went on, as my preferences changed a little bit, now I much prefer, I would say, like smaller palettes, not necessarily quads or even quints, but like a smaller palette. More of a handheld palette is my type of preference. So I wasn't dipping into this very much. However, back in 2021, my friend Kelly got married, and she asked me, I was a bridesmaid in her wedding, and she asked if I would do her makeup on her wedding day, and she kind of gave me an idea of what she wanted. We did a couple practice runs, and I used this palette for her wedding makeup. I used, if you look at the second to the last row, the third shadow in next to that royal blue shade, I remember putting that all over her lid. I want to say it was called Obsessed or something like that. But like I said, we did a couple trial runs. I used this eyeshadow palette on her. She was really happy with her look. I know her husband really enjoyed her makeup. And so I did keep this palette for a while after that. But as I found myself not using it and thinking that it was time to declutter it and give it away, I actually offered it to Kelly and asked her if she wanted it since it was her wedding makeup, and she took that palette. So I don't miss it out of my collection. I loved it for the time that I had it. I thought it was a great palette. I used the heck out of it, but it is now in a loving home somewhere else. I would say this next palette was almost an instant regret. When Kylie Cosmetics was like at her height with the lip kits. I remember, oh my gosh, those lip kits were going for like $200 or $300 on eBay. I did not buy them for that price, but I remember they were very, very expensive. Then she started coming out with eyeshadow palettes, and for whatever reason, the Blue Honey palette caught my eye. I don't know what it was about that palette, but it caught my eye, and I wanted to try it out. I purchased it. I thought, okay, 9 pans, love it. But this is not a color story that I was reaching for very often. You have like some neutral shades. The top row is pretty neutral. The bottom row has more copper shades. And then in the middle, you have those two pretty like turquoise blue shades and a gold. And I think the color story, it intrigued me. I still am looking at it and I think it's beautiful and the shimmers look beautiful. But knowing myself now, I'm like, I wouldn't get a lot of use out of it. And I think that's what happened is I purchased this palette. I perhaps created a couple looks either for Instagram or YouTube, and then it just sat in my collection. And ultimately, I think I sold it on Poshmark not too long after having it. It was very lightly used. It was one of those where I really was sucked in because I thought it was beautiful, but it wasn't realistic in my collection and I didn't use it very much. Speaking of Anastasia Beverly Hills, I went on to get several of her eyeshadow palettes. The Norvina palette, like the original collab with her daughter Norvina, was another purchase of mine. I did enjoy this eyeshadow palette. I thought the color story was fun, but there were very few shades in here that I used. I liked the idea of creating a bright pink look. I liked the idea of creating this purple look. I liked the idea of the drama shade and creating a smoky eye and that soul shade and putting it all over the crease. But I didn't really use those shades. I stuck to the browns, I stuck to the rose gold, the summer, the dazzling, and I just didn't reach into it a ton. I think the ABH formula is good. Her palettes are some of my most used in my collection, but for whatever reason, I just didn't reach for this palette a ton. I had it for a while, and then in going through a declutter, I actually ended up sending it to one of my friends that I met here on the beauty space on YouTube. She was I think we were talking about palettes one time or something, or maybe I was talking about doing a declutter, and I was like, hey, I have this palette, do you want it? And she was saying it was actually a palette that she was thinking of purchasing, so I was able to rehome it. And in that situation, I'm happy because it went to another like fellow makeup lover, and so I knew that she would really get good use out of it, and she was excited about it, and I honestly have not really thought about that eyeshadow palette since. Okay, this one did hurt me a little bit, so I'm pretty sure that my first Natasha Denona midi palette was the bronze palette. I had been wanting to love the Natasha Denona formula. Up until that point, I had just tried her Sunset Mini and I was not impressed with that, but people kept raving about the Natasha Denona formula. I was intrigued. I thought I love a bronze color story. So I went on to purchase the bronze palette, create several looks with it, and that's when I kind of fell in love with the Natasha Denona formula. I do think her formula is amazing. I thought the formula in this palette was amazing. However, there were a couple things about this palette that bothered me. First of all, I always like to set down my eyeshadow primer. There was not a shade in here that was light enough to set my eyeshadow primer. The lightest shade, Beach, still showed up as like a kind of a rich transition shade for me. There also was no inner corner pop. I love a light, bright inner corner. There was no inner corner pop here. Now, those two things are not enough for me to get rid of an eyeshadow palette or declutter it, but I found that when I would swatch the shimmer shades and swatch these eyeshadows, they looked very different. But anytime I would create a look on my eye, it ended up looking the same. Every eye look that I created looked very similar. It wasn't looking very different. And I was like, you know what? I just feel like if I'm going to spend upwards of $60 on an eyeshadow palette, I should really love it. I shouldn't have to dip into another eyeshadow palette to set my primer or for an inner corner. Like, if I'm going to spend this amount of money, it should be all encompassing. I should be able to create different looks, have everything that I need in it. And so ultimately, pretty quickly after getting this eyeshadow palette, I sold it on Poshmark, and I still think it's a great palette. I still think that there is a market for it. I think there are people who would really enjoy these eyeshadows, and I thought the quality was great. It just wasn't the right palette for me. I recently decluttered my Vive The Essential palette. I love Jamie Genevieve. I have been following her for years. When she started Vive Cosmetics, I knew I wanted to try her eyeshadows out. I loved the color story of this palette. It's very neutral. She called it the Essential palette. You have So Shy, which is light and bright. You have that, what is it, Goodnight shade, which is a deep black, and then you have like different shades of brown and shimmer shades. Now, I love a shimmer. This is matte heavy. There are only 3 shimmer shades, tongue twister. But when I got that eyeshadow palette, I found that I loved the mattes, super creamy and blendable. I loved the glimmer shade. It was a great shimmer, loved it all over the lid. But Carrot and Thea Jamie recommended using some kind of glitter glue to prime your eyes for those shadows to get them to stick, and I didn't have a glitter glue at the time. And even spraying my brush with Fix Plus, I still was not getting the pigment that I wanted out of those two shades. So I wasn't really reaching into this palette because although I thought the mattes were wonderful and I thought Glimmer was a great shade, I didn't love the other two shimmers, and I always put a shimmer on my lid. I don't really go for matte looks. So I kept this in my collection until she came out with the Muse palette. I purchased the Muse palette. I love that palette. If I'm going to use a palette from Vive, it's going to be the Muse palette. So this one I rehomed to one of my girlfriends, and I don't regret that. I honestly never should have purchased the avocado toast and blueberry muffin palettes from BH Cosmetics. I try to be thoughtful in my purchases. Yes, there are times when content creators will purchase things for the sole purpose of filming YouTube videos. And while there are times when I purchase things and think immediately, I want to film with that, I try to really only make purchases that I'm going to want to use outside of filming also, just because I don't really make money off of YouTube. Every maybe 4 to 6 months, I'll get a check from YouTube, but it's not a regular source of income for me by any means. So all that to say that I never What is my dog getting into? So I'm filming in my bedroom and my puppy's out there. Both of my dogs are out there, but the puppy, he just turned 1 in June. He can jump onto our coffee table, and he does that from time to time. I picked everything up off the floor before I came in here to film, and all of a sudden I heard like a crash, like a tiny crash, like something small fell to the floor. So I was like, what is that? He had jumped on the coffee table and gotten one of my daughter's necklaces. I was able to get to it before he tore it up and ate the beads because he just threw up from eating Play-Doh the other day. So, excuse me, that is what was happening there. I don't remember exactly what I was saying, but something along the lines of when I purchased avocado toast and blueberry muffin, I purchased them for the sole purpose of reviewing on YouTube. I was partially interested in trying them, but I knew before purchasing them that those color stories, neither one of them were going to be everyday palettes for me. But I was like, let me purchase these. I can review them. I can get views. Cool. I literally bought them, created looks with them, and then they sat in my collection and I never really reached for them. I thought the quality was great, but I knew ahead of time that that color story would not be my color story. And so that was kind of when I was like, wait a minute. I need to be more thoughtful in my purchases. I should not be purchasing makeup for the sole purpose of YouTube videos. I should be purchasing things that I am interested in that I also feel like I can make videos with. So that was kind of a turning point to me. I kept them both for a while. I ended up decluttering blueberry muffin first and avocado toast followed. And since then, I have kind of tried to watch myself and not make purchases like that because, like I said, I knew going in that I was purchasing them specifically for YouTube, and I don't want to do that. Okay, but that's gonna do it for this video. Those are not all of the eyeshadow palettes that I've owned and decluttered over the years, but like I said, I was just kind of scrolling through my feed and I saw some of these palettes and I was like, oh yeah, like I remember that. I remember the Lorac palette. I remember having the ABH World Traveler. I remember my Naked palette, and I just thought that this would be like a fun video, just taking a walk down memory lane, looking at some of my palettes. But I would love to know down below, do you have any of these still in your collection? Are any of these your favorites? Or are any of these palettes that you too have decluttered? I would love to know. But if you did enjoy this video, please go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed before you go. That way I can see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.